The sound came without warning, a single violent crack of metal against metal splitting the quiet of an empty intersection. A patrol car had driven straight into the rear of a black SUV, deliberately, without hesitation, the impact hard enough to rattle windows 2 blocks away. The officer stepped out slowly, adjusting his sunglasses, a grin already forming on his face, the kind of grin worn by a man who believed he was about to teach someone a lesson they would never forget. Inside the SUV, a woman sat completely still, her hands resting on the wheel, her expression unreadable. She did not shout. She did not reach for her phone in panic. She simply set it down on the passenger seat, looked into her mirror, and spoke 4 quiet words that would change everything in the next 7 minutes. Activate Protocol Sentinel. Within moments, a low mechanical rumble began to build somewhere beyond the horizon. Faint at first, then unmistakable, the sound of heavy engines converging from every direction at once. By the time the dust settled, 11 armored vehicles had surrounded the intersection, and every single one of them had stopped for her. Her name was Dr. Nyla Kensington, 39 years old, and to anyone glancing at her that afternoon, she looked like nothing more than a tired professional driving home after a long day. She wore a simple charcoal blazer, her hair pulled back neatly, her only visible possession of value, a slim leather folder resting on the passenger seat beside her phone. What no one could see was the 2 decades she had spent building a career that few people were ever allowed to know about. She had once commanded a federal tactical unit responsible for neutralizing domestic terror threats before they ever reached the evening news, a job that demanded absolute composure under conditions most people would never survive mentally intact. Now she served as the chief executive of a private security firm contracted directly by the federal government to protect the nation's most critical infrastructure, the power grids, the water systems, the unseen arteries that kept entire cities alive. She rarely spoke of any of it. She rarely needed to. That morning had been ordinary in every sense that mattered. She had sat through 3 hours of briefings about vulnerabilities in regional energy substations, the kind of meeting that involved maps most citizens would never be shown, and threat assessments most citizens would never be told about. When it ended, she thanked her colleagues, gathered her folder, and walked to her car alone, the same way she always did. There was no security detail trailing behind her, no black convoy of escort vehicles, no visible sign that she was anyone other than a woman heading home. She preferred it that way. Power, she had learned long ago, was never something worth advertising, and the less attention she drew to herself, the more effectively she could do the work that mattered most. She drove with the windows cracked, the early autumn air slipping through the gap, gray clouds hanging low over the city skyline. The streets were quiet that time of day, a lull between the morning rush and the evening one, and she used the silence the way she always did, to think, to plan, to let her mind settle after hours of tension. She had no reason to expect that anything about this drive would be different from 1,000 others before it. She checked her mirrors out of habit rather than concern, adjusted the radio to a low murmur of news, and continued forward through streets she had driven 100 times without incident. Colleagues who worked with her daily rarely spoke of her past in any detail, partly because she discouraged it, and partly because most of them simply did not know the full extent of what she had once done for a living. To the analysts and engineers who filled the floors of her firm's downtown office, she was simply the director, a woman who asked precise questions, who never raised her voice in a meeting, and who somehow always seemed to anticipate a threat 3 steps before anyone else in the room noticed it forming. She kept her personal life quiet, her home unremarkable, her routines deliberately ordinary, because she understood better than almost anyone what happened when a person of her position became too visible, too easy to track, too predictable to those who might wish her harm. Her mornings followed the same pattern most days: a run before sunrise, a review of overnight security reports over black coffee, a commute she insisted on handling herself rather than delegating to a driver. It was not stubbornness that kept her behind the wheel each day. It was a philosophy she had carried since her earliest years in federal service, the belief that comfort bred carelessness, and that a person responsible for protecting others could never afford to lose touch with the ordinary rhythms of the world she was sworn to defend. That philosophy had served her well for 2 decades, and nothing about the gray autumn afternoon ahead of her suggested it was about to be tested in a way she had not anticipated. A few blocks behind her, a patrol car idled at a red light, its driver watching her SUV pass with an interest that had nothing to do with any actual violation. Officer Bryce Hollister was 34 years old, restless by nature, the kind of man who measured his own authority by how quickly other people folded in front of it. He had built a private reputation, quiet but well known among certain colleagues, for testing people he decided did not belong somewhere, for finding small reasons to stop cars he found suspicious, for no reason he could ever fully explain. He saw the SUV, expensive, dark, driven by a black woman alone, and something in him decided immediately that this was worth following. He pulled out behind her without activating his lights, trailing at a careful distance, waiting for any excuse at all. The excuse, when it came, was almost laughably small. She had drifted perhaps 2 inches over a faded lane marking while checking her blind spot, a movement so minor that most officers would never have noticed it, let alone acted on it. Bryce flipped on his lights immediately, satisfaction settling into his chest as he watched her SUV signal calmly and pull to the curb without any hesitation. He approached the vehicle slowly, one hand resting near his belt, his posture deliberately exaggerated, the walk of a man performing authority, rather than simply holding it. He tapped twice on her window, and when she lowered it, he did not offer a greeting. He asked, flatly, for her to step out of the vehicle. Nyla studied him for a moment, taking in his stance, the tightness in his jaw, the way his eyes moved over her car with something closer to hostility than suspicion. She did not argue. She unbuckled her seatbelt, opened her door slowly and deliberately, and stepped onto the pavement with her hands visible the entire time. She kept her voice level as she asked what the issue was, and Bryce responded with a vague mention of a lane violation, his tone carrying an edge that suggested the real issue had very little to do with any lane at all. She nodded once, calm, and asked whether he needed her license and registration, already reaching slowly toward the folder on her seat. Her compliance seemed to unsettle him more than resistance would have. He had expected frustration, perhaps a raised voice, something he could use to justify escalating further, but instead he found himself facing a woman who answered every question evenly, who moved without sudden gestures, who watched him with an unreadable patience that made him feel, for reasons he could not name, smaller rather than larger. He circled her vehicle twice, running his hand along the frame, peering through the tinted rear windows as though searching for something incriminating. He found nothing. Her paperwork was flawless. Her tone remained polite. And still, something in him refused to let the moment end. He began asking questions that had nothing to do with the traffic stop at all. Where she worked, why she was driving alone, whose car this actually was, each question delivered with a faint sneer that suggested he already doubted every answer she might give. Nyla answered simply that the vehicle was hers, and that she was returning home from a work meeting, offering no further detail, no justification, no defensiveness. Her refusal to perform discomfort for him seemed to agitate him further. He stepped closer, his voice rising slightly, and told her that people like her needed to learn to respect an officer's authority, a statement that hung in the quiet street long after he said it. He asked to search her vehicle, a request with no legal grounding given the nature of the stop, and Nyla declined politely, informing him that he was welcome to call for a supervisor if he believed there was cause. The suggestion seemed to insult him further, as though the mere idea that she understood her rights well enough to decline calmly was itself a form of defiance he could not tolerate. He leaned toward her open window, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, and asked whether she understood who she was speaking to. She met his eyes without flinching and told him she understood exactly who she was speaking to, an officer performing a routine stop that had already exceeded its reasonable scope. The answer was too composed for him to argue with directly, and that composure seemed to bother him more than any argument could have. A delivery driver parked nearby had paused to watch the exchange, sensing something building that did not belong in an ordinary traffic stop. Bryce noticed the onlooker and straightened abruptly, seeming to recalibrate his approach now that an audience had formed. He softened his tone for a moment, just enough to sound reasonable to anyone listening from a distance, before returning his attention fully to Nyla with the same simmering hostility that had never actually left him. He informed her that he would be writing her a citation for the lane violation, regardless of how cooperative she had been, a decision that had nothing to do with the law, and everything to do with his need to feel that the encounter had ended on his terms rather than hers. A few pedestrians on the opposite sidewalk had slowed their pace, sensing the tension without yet understanding its shape. Nyla remained still, her expression calm, her eyes steady on his. She told him, evenly, that she had complied with every request and asked whether she was free to go. It was a simple question, entirely reasonable, and it seemed to be the final provocation Bryce needed. His jaw tightened, his hand flexed at his side, and for a brief moment, something behind his eyes shifted from irritation into something closer to rage. The particular rage of a man who has just realized he cannot make someone afraid of him, no matter how hard he tries. He told her, sharply, to get back in her vehicle, his voice carrying now, loud enough that the pedestrians across the street paused entirely to watch. Nyla returned to her seat without argument, closing the door gently, reaching for her seatbelt, as though the encounter had simply concluded the way countless mundane stops before it had. She checked her mirror, signaled, and began to pull slowly away from the curb, following every instruction she had been given. It was in that exact moment, as her SUV eased forward, that Bryce made the decision that would unravel everything he had ever built. He returned to his patrol car, slid into the driver's seat, and without any warning at all, without any radio call, without any justification he would later be able to articulate, he slammed his foot onto the accelerator. The patrol car surged forward and struck the rear of her SUV with a force that sent a violent jolt through the frame, metal crumpling, glass fracturing along the edges of her taillight, the sound of the collision echoing down the empty street like a gunshot. For a moment, everything went still. Nyla's hands tightened briefly on the wheel, her body absorbing the shock of the impact, but her expression did not break into panic. She sat for a moment, breathing evenly, assessing rather than reacting, the same instinct that had carried her through years of situations far more dangerous than this one. She checked her mirrors, confirmed she was uninjured, and only then did she turn her attention to the man now stepping out of his patrol car behind her. His expression already twisting into something defensive, already rehearsing the story he intended to tell. Bryce approached her window with none of the confidence he had carried moments earlier. His voice was fast, clipped, blaming her instantly for the collision, insisting she had reversed unexpectedly, insisting she had caused the impact herself through some sudden and reckless movement. It was a lie so immediate and so poorly constructed that even the pedestrians watching from across the street exchanged uncertain glances. Nyla lowered her window fully and looked at him without raising her voice, without matching the panic he seemed to want her to display. She told him simply that she had been moving forward exactly as instructed, and that the impact had come entirely from behind. Her calm seemed to enrage him further. He warned her that if she continued arguing, he would place her under arrest for obstruction, a threat that carried no legal weight but was clearly meant to frighten her into silence. More pedestrians had gathered now along the sidewalk, several of them lifting their phones, capturing the scene from multiple angles, the crumpled bumper, the officer's raised voice, the woman sitting motionless and composed behind the wheel of a vehicle that had just been rammed without cause. Nyla noticed the phones. She said nothing about them. Her focus remained entirely on the man in front of her, watching him the way she might once have watched a hostile actor during an operation, cataloging every word, every gesture, every inconsistency in his story. One bystander, an older man walking his dog, called out that he had seen the entire thing and that the officer had clearly struck the SUV without provocation. Bryce spun toward him, ordering him to step back and mind his own business, his voice cracking slightly under the strain of a situation that was no longer following any script he recognized. The man did not retreat. He simply lowered his phone slightly, made sure the recording continued, and told Bryce evenly that he intended to make sure the footage reached the right people. A second witness, a young woman on her way home from work, echoed the same account, describing the impact as sudden, deliberate, and entirely unprompted by anything the SUV had done. Bryce's composure, already thin, began to fracture visibly under the weight of so many eyes. He paced beside his damaged cruiser, radio in hand, his story shifting slightly each time he repeated it, first blaming a sudden reverse movement, then insisting his brakes had failed, then falling back to vague accusations about her attitude during the stop. None of the explanations aligned with what the growing crowd had witnessed with their own eyes, and the inconsistency itself became its own kind of evidence, visible to everyone, present long before any official investigation would ever confirm it. She reached for her own phone, unhurried, and dialed a number she had memorized years ago but had never once needed to use in the field. When the call connected, she did not raise her voice. She did not explain the situation, did not describe the collision, did not offer any context at all. She spoke 6 words, evenly and without emotion, and then ended the call before the line could even fully open. "Protocol Sentinel," she said. "Red level." Nothing more. Bryce watched her, his confusion visible beneath the anger, still tightening his features. He laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and told her that pretending to have important connections would not save her from the consequences of what he was certain she had done. He assumed she was bluffing, the way he assumed most people bluffed when they felt powerless in front of a badge, and he continued speaking as though nothing about the situation had changed at all, listing threats, listing charges, his voice rising with every sentence, as though volume alone could restore the authority he felt slipping away from him. What he did not know, what he could not possibly have known, was that the moment her call connected, a chain of events had already begun moving far beyond his control. On the other end of that line, inside a secured command facility miles away, an operator had received a 2-word alert that triggered an immediate verification protocol reserved for a very small number of individuals nationwide. Nyla's identity was confirmed within seconds against a federal registry rarely accessed outside of extreme circumstances. Her vehicle, unbeknownst to Bryce, carried encrypted equipment tied directly to national infrastructure protection, equipment that fell under strict federal jurisdiction the instant it was deliberately damaged. Within 90 seconds, alerts began populating across multiple secured channels simultaneously. Inside that command facility, the duty officer who received the alert did not hesitate to escalate it, understanding immediately what the designation meant without needing further explanation. A supervisor was notified within seconds, and from there, the notification moved upward through the chain with a speed built for exactly this kind of emergency. Each recipient trained to treat the words "Protocol Sentinel" as an instruction rather than a suggestion. Cross-referencing systems confirmed not only Nyla's identity, but the precise location of her vehicle through its embedded tracking beacon, a feature installed quietly in every vehicle assigned to personnel of her clearance level, invisible to anyone unaware of its existence, and activated automatically the moment a distress signal of that classification was received. Separate from the local police response, Bryce had unknowingly triggered through his own radio call. An entirely independent federal channel had now opened, one that operated with no awareness of and no interest in whatever story he intended to tell his supervisors. The two systems, local and federal, were converging on the same intersection from completely different directions, moving at completely different speeds, and only one of them understood the true scale of what was actually unfolding on that ordinary street. At a nearby staging facility, tactical teams that had been on standby for an unrelated exercise received the alert and redirected instantly. Engines roaring to life, drivers pulling onto access roads before their commanding officer had even finished briefing them on the situation. Overhead, a helicopter already airborne for routine patrol banked sharply and adjusted course toward the coordinates now flashing on its navigation display. None of the officers receiving these alerts needed further explanation. The words Protocol Sentinel carried weight on their own, a designation understood instantly by anyone cleared to hear it, a designation that meant a protected federal asset had come under direct physical threat. Back at the intersection, Bryce remained entirely unaware, still pacing beside his damaged patrol car, still muttering into his radio about a woman who refused to cooperate. He had requested backup for what he described as a hostile and uncooperative driver, expecting perhaps one additional unit to arrive and reinforce his version of events. He had no reason to expect anything more. He glanced periodically at Nyla, who remained seated calmly in her vehicle, her hands folded, her eyes fixed somewhere past him, watching the horizon the way a person watches for weather they already know is coming. The first sound arrived faintly, a low, mechanical hum that most people would have mistaken for distant construction. Bryce did not notice it at first, too absorbed in his own frustration, too certain that the situation remained entirely within his control. But the hum grew steadily louder, resolving slowly into the unmistakable rhythm of heavy engines, multiple engines, approaching from several directions at once. The pedestrians on the sidewalk fell silent, phones still raised, their attention shifting from the crumpled bumper to the horizon where dark shapes had begun to emerge. Within minutes, the quiet street transformed entirely. Armored vehicles rounded corners from 4 separate directions, their engines deep and deliberate, tires gripping the pavement with a weight that seemed to press the entire block into stillness. Above them, a helicopter descended low enough to stir loose papers along the sidewalk, its rotors cutting through the gray afternoon air with a violence that made several bystanders instinctively step backward. Bryce turned toward the sound, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion into something closer to disbelief, watching as vehicle after vehicle rolled to a stop around the intersection, until 11 of them formed a wide, deliberate perimeter, with Nyla's damaged SUV at its center. The bystanders who had gathered earlier now stood frozen at the edges of the scene, phones still raised, but their expressions shifting from curiosity into something closer to awe. Traffic on the surrounding blocks had already been redirected by officers positioned at each intersection entrance, orange cones and flashing barricades appearing with a speed that suggested this level of response had been rehearsed many times before, even if it had rarely, if ever, been needed for a situation quite like this one. The dog walker who had spoken up earlier lowered his phone slightly, staring at the wall of armored vehicles now surrounding the woman he had defended minutes earlier, clearly struggling to reconcile the scale of what he was witnessing with the ordinary traffic stop it had begun as. Bryce's remaining colleagues, the 2 additional officers who had arrived earlier in response to his initial backup request, stood near their own patrol car with a stillness that betrayed their own confusion. Neither of them had received any information beyond a vague report of an uncooperative driver, and neither of them had any framework for understanding why a fleet of federal tactical vehicles was now converging on a fender bender. One of them turned toward Bryce and asked quietly what exactly he had gotten them into, a question Bryce had no answer for, his mouth opening and closing without sound as the reality of the situation settled over him with crushing weight. Doors opened in near unison, tactical personnel stepping out with a discipline that made clear this was no ordinary response. Bryce instinctively reached for his radio, then let his hand fall, uncertain what exactly he was supposed to say. His earlier confidence had drained entirely from his posture, replaced by the particular stillness of a man realizing, far too late, that he had badly misjudged the moment. The street, moments ago the site of a routine dispute, now resembled something closer to a federal operation, cordoned, guarded, and utterly beyond his authority. From the center vehicle stepped a tall man in his early 50s, his uniform, unmarked by rank insignia, visible to civilians, but unmistakably commanding in the way every officer around him deferred instantly to his presence. His name was Commander Elias Rowan, and he moved through the scene without hesitation, without glancing once at Bryce, his attention fixed entirely on the woman still seated calmly behind the wheel of her SUV. He crossed the pavement in long, unhurried strides, stopped beside her door, and lowered himself slightly to meet her eyes through the open window. "Are you injured, ma'am?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost gentle, a stark contrast to the imposing scale of the operation unfolding around them. Nyla shook her head once, calm as ever, and told him she was fine, that the damage was to the vehicle rather than to herself. Rowan studied her for a long moment, something in his expression softening slightly, the recognition of two people who had once shared far more dangerous circumstances than this one. He straightened, turned toward the gathered officers and personnel now filling the intersection, and addressed them without raising his voice, his authority requiring no volume at all. He informed the assembled crowd, in clear and measured words, exactly who they were standing in the presence of. Dr. Nyla Kensington, he explained, served as the director of a federally contracted program responsible for the protection of the nation's most critical infrastructure systems. The vehicle behind her, the one that had just been deliberately struck, carried secured equipment classified under federal jurisdiction, equipment whose damage constituted far more than a simple traffic incident. Any act of aggression against her person or her vehicle, he continued, fell under statutes reserved for threats against protected federal assets, statutes that carried consequences far beyond anything typically associated with a local traffic stop. Bryce stood frozen as the words settled over him, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman he had dismissed minutes earlier with the figure now being described in front of dozens of witnesses. He opened his mouth, some fragment of explanation forming, but no sound emerged. Around him, the other officers who had arrived earlier in response to his initial call exchanged uncertain glances of their own, none of them having known any more than he had. All of them now recalculating everything they thought they understood about the woman sitting quietly in the damaged SUV. Rowan continued, his tone measured but unyielding, explaining that the equipment inside her vehicle formed part of a broader encrypted communication network used to coordinate responses across several regional power grids, a network whose integrity depended entirely on the physical security of vehicles exactly like hers. Damage of the kind Bryce had inflicted was not simply property destruction in the ordinary sense, he explained. It was, under the statutes governing critical infrastructure protection, treated as a direct act against national security infrastructure, regardless of whether the officer responsible had understood the significance of what he was striking. Ignorance of her role, Rowan added quietly, did not change the legal weight of what had occurred, only the motive behind it, and the motive here appeared to have nothing to do with infrastructure at all. The words landed heavily on everyone present. Several of the newly arrived tactical personnel began methodically photographing the damage to Nyla's vehicle, documenting the exact points of impact, the depth of the collision, the debris fields scattered across the pavement. Others moved to secure the perimeter more tightly, ensuring no further contamination of the scene before the formal collection of evidence could begin. Bryce watched all of it unfold around him, with the dazed expression of a man who had walked into an ordinary morning and somehow, through his own actions alone, transformed it into the defining catastrophe of his career. Rowan turned his attention next to the growing crowd of bystanders, many of whom still held their phones raised, capturing every second of the unfolding scene. He did not ask them to stop. He did not attempt to control the narrative or shield the moment from public view. Instead, he requested calmly that anyone with footage of the incident preserve it, explaining that any recorded evidence would be essential to the investigation that was about to begin. Several onlookers nodded, some visibly stunned by how quickly the situation had transformed from an ordinary dispute into something resembling a federal response. Within the hour, investigators arrived to begin the methodical work of reconstructing exactly what had happened. They reviewed footage from a traffic camera mounted at the intersection, its angle capturing the entire sequence in unambiguous detail, the SUV pulling away exactly as instructed, the patrol car accelerating suddenly and striking it from behind, with clear and deliberate force. They reviewed the dashboard camera from Bryce's own vehicle, its recording confirming the same sequence, with a precision that left no room for alternate interpretation. They collected footage from at least 6 separate bystanders, each clip corroborating the others, each one stripping away any possibility that Bryce's version of events might survive scrutiny. Bryce attempted, weakly, to offer an explanation, insisting the collision had been accidental, that his foot had slipped, that the vehicle in front of him had made an unexpected movement he could not have anticipated. No one around him appeared to believe a word of it. The footage told a story too consistent, too deliberate, too thoroughly documented, from too many independent angles for any explanation involving accident or misunderstanding to hold together. Rowan listened to the excuse without interruption, his expression unreadable, and when Bryce finished speaking, he said nothing in response at all, the silence itself carrying more weight than any rebuke could have. Investigators cross-referenced the timestamps across every piece of footage collected, building a second-by-second timeline that left no gap for interpretation. The traffic camera showed Nyla's vehicle signaling and merging smoothly, well within the flow of traffic. At the exact moment, Bryce's patrol car accelerated from a full stop behind her. His own dashboard camera, which he had likely forgotten was even recording, captured his foot pressing the accelerator with clear and unmistakable force, rather than any sudden, panicked motion, consistent with an accident. The bystander clips, gathered from 4 separate phones at 4 separate angles, all showed the same sequence with no meaningful variation. A level of consistency, investigators later noted, was rare, even in far simpler cases. A forensic technician examined the physical damage to both vehicles as well, confirming that the pattern of impact was consistent with a direct, accelerating collision, rather than a low-speed drift or an accidental roll. The findings were compiled into a preliminary report within hours, a speed that reflected both the severity of the alleged offense and the unusual volume of corroborating evidence available from the very beginning. Rowan reviewed the report personally before authorizing the next step, wanting to be certain that every conclusion rested on documented fact rather than assumption, a standard he insisted on applying to every case that passed through his command, regardless of who was involved. The order came swiftly and without ceremony. Rowan instructed the officers present to collect Bryce's badge and weapon on the spot, to formally place him on suspension, pending a full investigation, the process carried out in front of the very crowd that had gathered to witness the earlier confrontation. Bryce stood motionless as his badge was removed from his belt, his weapon secured by another officer, the physical symbols of an authority he had spent years abusing, now taken from him in the middle of an ordinary street, in full view of dozens of witnesses. As the investigation unfolded further that afternoon, Rowan found a quiet moment to speak privately with several of the officers who had known Nyla only by reputation, sharing details that most of them had never heard before. Years earlier, during an assault on a secured federal facility, Nyla had been the ranking officer present when the situation collapsed into chaos. Communications severed, exits compromised, dozens of federal employees trapped inside a building under direct threat. She had organized an evacuation under conditions that should have made survival for everyone involved statistically unlikely, moving through the building floor by floor, coordinating extraction routes, with a composure that colleagues who witnessed it still described. Years later, with something close to reverence. By the time the situation was resolved, every single employee inside that building had made it out alive. A result that senior officials at the time considered close to miraculous, given the scale of the threat they had faced. She was offered the nation's highest civilian commendation for the operation, a formal ceremony, public recognition, the kind of honor most people in her field spent entire careers hoping to receive. She declined it. She asked instead that the recognition be quietly redirected toward funding for the families of 2 colleagues who had not made it out of the building that day. And shortly afterward, she stepped away from active federal service entirely. Rowan had been there that day too. One of the officers she had guided out through a service corridor most people did not even know existed, and he still remembered, with total clarity, the sound of her voice over a failing radio channel, calmly directing dozens of frightened people towards safety while explosions echoed somewhere behind her. He remembered the way she had refused to leave the building herself until she had confirmed every last person was accounted for, refusing every order to evacuate until her own count matched the official roster twice over. It was a detail he had never forgotten, and one he made certain to share now with officers who had only ever known her, until this afternoon, as an unfamiliar face behind the wheel of a damaged SUV. He explained that in the years since leaving federal service, she had built her firm from nothing, recruiting former operators and engineers who shared her belief that the systems ordinary people relied on every single day deserved the same rigorous protection once reserved for military installations. Under her leadership, the firm had quietly prevented several attempted intrusions into regional power systems that never made the news, incidents the public would likely never learn the full details of, precisely because her methods emphasized prevention over publicity. It was, Rowan said, a philosophy that defined everything about how she operated in her professional life and, as everyone standing in that intersection had now witnessed firsthand, in the most personally threatening moments as well. She did not retreat from the work, though. She simply chose to continue it in a different form, building a private firm dedicated to protecting the exact kind of critical infrastructure that had nearly been destroyed that day: power systems, water treatment facilities, communication networks, the invisible foundations that ordinary life depended on without most people ever realizing it. It was this history, this record of sacrifice carried quietly rather than announced, that explained, without any ambiguity, why the federal response to her damaged vehicle had arrived with such overwhelming speed and scale. She was not simply an executive. She was, in every meaningful sense, someone the government had a direct and enduring obligation to protect. As word of the incident spread through official channels, a formal criminal investigation into Bryce's conduct was opened by the evening, moving with a speed that surprised even seasoned observers of similar cases in the past. Footage of the collision, obtained through public records requests, filed almost immediately by local reporters, began circulating widely across news outlets within hours, each replay making the deliberate nature of the impact unmistakable to anyone who watched it. City officials, facing mounting pressure from a public outrage by what they had seen, announced an independent review of the police department's traffic stop practices, a review that would extend well beyond Bryce's individual case into broader patterns that had gone unexamined for years. Inside the department itself, reactions to the unfolding scandal were far from uniform. Several officers who had worked alongside Bryce expressed genuine shock, describing him privately as someone whose temper had always concerned them, but whose conduct had never before crossed so clearly into deliberate harm. Others admitted, more quietly, that they had suspected for some time that his aggression towards certain drivers followed patterns they had chosen not to question closely enough. The department's leadership, facing intense public scrutiny, distanced itself from him almost immediately, releasing a statement that condemned his actions in the strongest possible terms and promised full cooperation with every stage of the investigation. Through all of it, Nyla remained remarkably measured in her public response. When reporters eventually reached her for comment, she gave no lengthy statement, no dramatic condemnation, nothing that resembled a demand for personal vengeance against the man who had rammed her vehicle without cause. She said only that no one, regardless of the badge they wore or the authority they believed it granted them, stood above the law, and that she trusted the investigation to proceed exactly as it should, guided by evidence rather than emotion. It was a simple statement, delivered without anger, and it carried far more weight for its restraint than any furious denouncement could have managed. The city council convened an emergency session less than a week after the footage became public, inviting testimony from civil rights advocates, department leadership, and independent legal experts to examine not only the specifics of Bryce's conduct, but the broader patterns that had allowed an officer with a documented history of complaints to remain on active patrol duty without meaningful review. Records surfaced during the hearings showing that Bryce had accumulated 11 prior citizen complaints over the course of his career, each one alleging some version of the same aggressive, unprovoked behavior, none of which had ever resulted in serious disciplinary action. The revelation intensified public scrutiny considerably, transforming the conversation from a single reckless act into a broader reckoning with institutional failure. Community organizers who had followed similar cases for years pointed to the incident as a rare example where accountability had arrived swiftly and decisively, a contrast they noted pointedly against countless other cases where officers accused of similar conduct faced little more than a temporary desk assignment. They were careful, however, to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth underlying that swift response, that the speed of accountability in this case had been driven substantially by Nyla's federal status rather than by the strength of the department's ordinary oversight processes alone. It was a distinction Nyla herself raised in one of her only extended public comments, noting quietly that justice should never depend on who a victim happens to be, and that the response she received was owed, in principle, to every person who found themselves in a similar position, regardless of their title or clearance level. In the weeks that followed, the investigation moved steadily toward its conclusion. Prosecutors reviewing the accumulated footage found the case against Bryce essentially undeniable. The traffic camera, the dashboard recording, and the collection of bystander footage all aligning without contradiction. He was formally charged with reckless endangerment and destruction of federal property, charges that carried the very real possibility of significant prison time, given the deliberate nature of his actions and the protected status of the vehicle he had struck. His attorney attempted early on to argue that he had acted out of a momentary lapse in judgment, but the consistency of the evidence made that argument increasingly difficult to sustain as the proceedings continued. He was formally terminated from the police department less than a month after the incident, the decision announced publicly alongside the department's broader commitment to reforming how traffic stops were conducted across the city. For Bryce, the consequences extended far beyond the loss of his position. The career he had built his entire identity around was gone, replaced by pending criminal charges and a public record that would follow him indefinitely, the direct result of a single reckless decision made in a moment when he believed, with total and misplaced confidence, that no one would ever hold him accountable. Commander Rowan requested a private meeting with Nyla shortly after the department's formal actions were finalized, arriving without any of the tactical presence that had surrounded their first meeting on that street weeks earlier. He apologized to her directly, on behalf of every officer who had allowed a pattern of unchecked aggression to continue unexamined for as long as it had, acknowledging that the failure went beyond any single individual. Nyla listened to him without interrupting, and when he finished, she offered a response that carried none of the bitterness he might reasonably have expected from her. Trust, she told him, was never built through apology alone. It was built through the actions that followed it, through consistent accountability, through the willingness of institutions to examine their own failures honestly rather than defensively. Rowan nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what she had said, and told her that the department intended to use the case as the foundation for genuine reform in how officers were trained and supervised going forward. She did not promise to believe that the change would hold. She simply told him that she hoped, sincerely, that it would. She returned to her car that afternoon, the same SUV that had been repaired weeks earlier, its damage erased but its history impossible to forget for anyone who had witnessed what happened that day. She settled behind the wheel, adjusted her mirror out of habit, and pulled away from the curb exactly the way she always did, without escort, without spectacle, without any outward sign that she was anything other than a woman heading home after a long day. The street around her had long since returned to its ordinary rhythm, pedestrians walking past without a second glance, traffic moving in its familiar patterns, no trace remaining of the 11 armored vehicles that had once filled that same intersection. Bryce's trial, when it finally began months later, drew a modest but attentive crowd, reporters filling several rows, a handful of former colleagues sitting quietly near the back, watching a man they had once trusted with their own safety, now facing the consequences of a decision made in a single, reckless instant. He did not testify in his own defense. His attorney's final arguments leaned heavily on the absence of any prior violent intent, a strategy that gained little traction against a jury that had already watched the footage dozens of times over the course of the proceedings. When the verdict was read, guilty on both counts, Bryce showed no visible reaction at all, simply lowering his head as the weight of the outcome settled fully over him for the first time. Nyla did not attend the trial. She had made a quiet decision early on that her presence there would serve no purpose beyond spectacle, and spectacle had never been something she sought in any part of her life. She continued her work exactly as she had before, reviewing threat assessments, briefing engineers, driving herself home each evening through streets that no longer held any particular weight for her beyond the ordinary. If she thought often about that afternoon, she never said so publicly, and those who knew her best understood that this too was simply who she was, a woman who carried enormous weight without ever needing to display it. What lingered, long after the vehicles had dispersed and the cameras had stopped rolling, was not the memory of overwhelming force, but the quieter truth underneath it. Power, real power, was never measured by how much fear a person could produce in others. It was measured by restraint, by the discipline to wield authority only in service of what was right, by the willingness to let evidence and process determine outcomes rather than instinct or prejudice. No one deserved to be judged by the color of their skin, the vehicle they drove, or the assumptions strangers made about them in a passing glance. And when authority was abused in defiance of that principle, accountability had to follow, built not on outrage alone, but on documentation, on procedure, on the steady and unglamorous work of doing things correctly. That, in the end, was the only kind of justice that ever truly lasted.